Greetings, friends. I would like to start off by thanking the Scranton Area Ministerium for sponsoring this very special lecture in honor of the United Nations World Interfaith Harmony Week. World Interfaith Harmony Week has been celebrated every year since 2011, and so we're already in the 11th year of this program that the United Nations has sponsored. And it's nice for us to take some time to talk about this ideal of interfaith harmony. I myself work as a prison chaplain. I've been in prison ministry since 2009, on and off, as well as other types of chaplaincy work and mental health, which in some ways has a lot of intersections and commonalities with prison ministry. And when I heard about this World Interfaith Harmony Week from the Scranton Area Ministerium, which is this is the first time I remember hearing about this special week, the first thing that I thought is that working in prison, working inside, as we say, really taught me so much about interfaith harmony that never struck me before I started working in this type of chaplaincy work. It's often said that a prison is like a town, right? A town has a store, a barber shop, a hospital, a doctor's office, dentist's office, a school, has a population, has the people who live there, has the people who work there who might not live there. It also has a church, synagogue, a mosque, and many other communities that might not interact on a regular basis. See, that's the difference in the prison. You have a captive audience. So you're kind of stuck with whoever you're stuck with. And you might encounter in a prison not just your regular run-of-the-mill, whatever the majority happens to be where you live. You'll run into expressions of religion and spirituality that you might not see every day. And you're forced to be there. You don't have a choice. And if you're working there, you're forced to work with these different communities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, the mission of corrections is to correct, right? And to correct a problem that exists. We kind of say that we're doing a service to the community. We want to send the guys back, men and women who are incarcerated, we want to send them back home better than they got in. That's our job. That's what we're doing here. But in the sense of justice and social justice, and even criminal justice reform, we have to recognize that we're not only treating a symptom, that a person committed a crime, but we also have to look at the root causes of the crime and see what can we do to correct those things. Those things that exist not only within the criminal himself or herself who committed the crime and became a convict in the system, but the societal issues at large. What is it that causes someone to act in an antisocial way? What happens to cause this aberrant behavior that we want to correct? What is it in society that we can correct? And so much can be learned from this model of the Department of Corrections. How do we interact with people? How do we interact with various communities? And I think we can learn a lot about harmony. Harmony doesn't mean everybody's the same. Harmony doesn't even mean everyone necessarily has to agree with everyone else. Harmony doesn't mean that everyone has to be on the same page, agreeing all together. Harmony means that within the plurality that exists, within the diversity that exists, there is a harmony. There is a balance. There is a certain agreement. That we might not agree on everything. Sometimes we agree to disagree. But there is a commonality that is all throughout. I remember there's a website that I like to answer questions on. They ask people, various people throughout the world will ask questions, and then anyone can really answer them. And someone once asked, I'd like to know what happens when a pastor and a priest and a rabbi and an imam all sit in a room together. And I, as a supervisor for a department in one facility, I do that quite often. And it's really nothing that exotic. We're all pretty much doing the same thing what we always do. We talk about our work, we have a meeting perhaps every month or so to discuss the mission of our work. Or sometimes we just talk. It's not that often that we talk about religion, sometimes we do. But we find out things about each other that we're really not that different. And I think that's also a key to harmony. Celebrating our differences while recognizing those things that we all have in common. And I find myself working in a prison. We find ourselves sometimes encountering different religions, not only from ones that we might be familiar with, ones that we never even heard of before getting into prison, ones that we might have heard, or if we heard of them, we heard only the worst, most negative things before we encountered them. Many years ago, I was a chaplain, very part-time, in a federal prison in Virginia. My first synagogue congregation that I was the senior rabbi at was in Virginia. And among the many people that I encountered there, I would say this is probably the first time that I encountered someone who was a member of the Nation of Islam community, which is different than the mainstream Islamic community, than the Orthodox Islamic community. They have their own ideas, and I always kind of heard, those guys, they don't like Jews, and they don't like white people. And so perhaps from all of the prejudices that I'd been taught, I might have had a reason to be a little bit afraid. But I really wasn't. This man seemed like a nice person, even though he was an inmate, he was a convict. But we had a very brief conversation that I thought was very interesting. He spoke about how his family had been members of this community, the Nation of Islam community, for generations already. But then he said something that was very interesting, because I'm not a Christian. I'm pretty obviously, anyone who's familiar with the way I'm dressing and everything, I'm a very strict Orthodox Hasidic Jew. And this man was a member of the Nation of Islam. And yet, he told me something that really struck me about a person who I know did not always agree with the Nation of Islam, had some differences. That was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is rightfully venerated as almost an American saint that transcends the bonds of his own religious tradition as a preacher in the Baptist church. And this inmate said to me that Dr. King was the most Christ-like person in the 20th century. And I've reflected upon that really for years since I heard that, discussed it at other events too. And thinking about that idea, here you have someone who obviously, as a Christian pastor, was striving to emulate the examples that Jesus of Nazareth presented as his tradition records. And when you think about it, here's a man who was killed in his 30s trying to spread a message, and how his message got much stronger after his death. The parallels are pretty obvious. And it's interesting how I, as a Jew, someone who is not a follower or a believer in Jesus, and him as a member of the Nation of Islam who has issues perhaps with Dr. King and his message and has different views about Jesus than Christians do. And yet we could both recognize that. For me, not only this idea about what he said was important, but that ability for us to connect as two human beings through these words that he said to me. And whatever, I don't even remember what I said to him. I don't think it was that important, perhaps, but maybe to him it was. I'm not sure. It shows the possibility that people who are very different can find commonality.